Welcome to Diversity and Culture. My name is Victoria Oladele, and our topic for this week is diversity scenarios and case evaluation. Diversity refers to the general understanding or appreciation of everyone's differences based on different dimensions such as color, race, ethnicity, religion, age, sex, and gender. This article looks at different scenarios which enhance understanding of the core factor and issues related to diversity. The first case study we will be looking into is the University and Community College System of Nevada versus the farmer. According to Gerekar 2020, deontological ethics or deontology was formed by Immanuel Kant, who believed that the result of an individual's action is not important, rather, the moral intention of the action or a particular decision is the most important when determining ethical and unethical behaviors. This implies that the deontology theory is contrary to the consequentialism theory in that it disregards the consequence and focus on the moral obligation to perform imperative duties which should not be abandoned at all costs. Jurica 2020 suggests that Kant believed that moral obligations are absolute and apply equally to every individual at all costs. The perspective in this theory is that emphasis on duty as an imperative aspect fosters the responsibility of the law enforcement officer to carry out their tasks regardless of what personal perspective or willingness or not to do so or not. In other words, this approach requires that duty that an individual is assigned to carry out may have some negative impact, but this does not prevent them from completing the task because it is absolute or imperative. According to Zumar and Medina 2017, the imperative duty falls into two categories: conditional and categorical imperatives. A conditional imperative duty is an obligation that is based on completing a particular task or achieving a specific goal. For instance, a business owner can commit extra time in the business to achieve better performances or establish growth. On the other hand, categorical imperative duty is an unconditional obligation in which an individual must take the expected decision and regardless of the consequence, that task must be accomplished. This approach implies that regardless of the result, no one should use other others for their benefit, and every individual exists as an end and not a mere means. This context shows that every individual deserves to be treated with respect regardless of the result. In the case of University and Community of College System of Nevada versus a farmer, the court rules that the farmer should be awarded $40,000 for the damage caused due to violation of the Equal Pay Act. It is the obligation of every organization to ensure that all employees are treated equally according to the ontology approach. The court, the court also has an absolute obligation to ensure justice is upheld and enforce the requirements of law such as the Equal Pay Act. With this in mind, the Supreme Court decision to deny the university and community college system a hearing for the appeal is based on the court's obligation to establish justice for the farmer, regardless of the consequence that the defendant will face. Moreover, the Supreme Court must have applied this approach to discourage the defendant from taking advantage of the farmer. This decision discourages the defendant from violating the Equal Pay Act again in their business activities and practices. It promotes the universal application of the law, emphasis essential of duty, and foster respect of humanity. The next case study is that of the Watchmark Commuter Cooperation Outsourcing case. Teleological ethics, or what is also referred to as consequentialism, is identified as the contrast of deontology, according to Grachev 2017. This approach is typically result-oriented since it determines morality based on the perspective of good or bad, um, either result or consequences. This approach considers that the result of a decision or an action are more significant than the process when determining if an individual has behaved morally or not. Kornhauser LH 2018 suggests, based on this approach, an individual is only ethical if the decision made has the greatest and most desirable result for most people. The perspective in this approach is that moral action does result in happiest to the highest percentage of people. Therefore, there is a possible form an individual to justify their action even if they disrespect the right of a few. In another word, an individual in this approach can justify a wrong as long as the decision has a greater good to the most of the people. The Watchmark communal cooperation outsourcing approach based on the teleological perspective allows a company and its stakeholder to have more access to employees to meet its obligation and customer expectation effectively. If the company prefers outsourcing as the technology with the greatest benefit with justifiable means, then it is ethical according to a teleological perspective. In contrast, the company is more immoral because in this case it is using people as a means and not an end. In other words, for its own benefit and advantage of the result. Is it easier for employers to comply with diversity legislation in Canada than in the US? In this case, the best way to tell if it is easy for employers' compliance with diversity legislation is to understand and compare the legislation and diversity in Canada and the US. That being said, the history of Canada reveals that it has been declared a multicultural nation for a long time in history. Unlike the USA, it does not have a record of discrimination. Toussaint Miller 2017 suggests that in 1971, Pierre Trudeau, former prime minister, declared this nation as a country that allows every individual, regardless of their culture, ethnicity, gender, and color, to live as free citizens with a right to carry on their duties and obligations in the society to fulfill their needs. This is covered in the Multiculturalism Act of 1988 and the Canadian Human Rights Act of 1985. According to Toussaint Miller, 2017, the Canadian Human Rights Act is the primary legislation that protects people against any form of discrimination, regardless if it is based on religion, gender, identity, race, marital status, age, or ethnicity. The Canadian human rights also account for the protection of employees in workplaces and organizations to ensure that each worker is protected against discriminatory practices from the employer or among peer workers. St. Miller 2017 states that this act, the leader, managers, and employers are responsible for ensuring compliance and protection of their employee. On the other hand, the history of the United States of America diversity states with a significant starts, excuse me, starts with a significantly different perspective in which people are exposed to discrimination and violence. On the same note, the diversity legislation in the United States has been established over a long time than Canada. Fletcher Hill 2017 suggests that the recognition of discrimination and the establishment of legislation to address the issues has been established in the United States for over 2 decades before Canada could do the same. For instance, the Civil Rights Act was enacted in 1964 in the United States, and the Constitution informs the public on the need to address discrimination and the related laws. According to Fletcher Hill 2017, the purpose of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is to prohibit discrimination in the public place and public facilities. Since then, diversity legislation has significantly improved and changes to account to other issues. Fletcher stated that some of the primary diversity legislative include Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Equal Pay Act of 1963, Age Discrimination in Employment Act, American with Disability Act, Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and Family and Medical Leave Act. Based on the comparison between Canada and the United States, uh, it cannot be easier for an employer in Canada to comply with diversity legislation than the employer in the United States. Typically, the United States employer are more versed with diversity legislation because the government offers more resource to educate the public about different acts and the act that addresses different issues. For instance, in the comparison between the number of legislation that explains the legal requirements of the employers. The United States of America has a broad list and more detailed acts than Canada. The Constitution also plays how the employer learns about the legal requirements in a different form of diversity legislation. The more employer and the public learn about diversity legislation, the more they understand the importance and need to comply, and hence it is easier for an employer in the United States to comply with diversity legislation than those in Canada because they are well versed with what is expected from them by the legal authority. Print media, mass circulation newspaper stories. Drash 2015, in a CNN article entitled Race and Reality in America, outlines the story that discusses in details about the issues of racism in America. In this report, the writer states with an outline of several scenes in which a black American is pulled over by a police officer, which shows that in America, even the government agencies such as the police that are supposed to protect the citizen are engaged in racism. The context in this report shows that 1 in every 5 African American report cases or are involved in unfair dealing or harassment with the police. This contributes to about 19% of African American how to experience unfair treatment in an in a month. Drash 2015. On the contrary, the percentage of white who experience an unfair treatment by the police in the United States is about 3%. The general context in this report set a negative tone of inequality and high racism among African Americans. Based on this report, it is apparent that the police force in the United States does not treat African Americans the same way they treat the Americans. For instance, the rate of unfair treatment among African Americans is disproportionate compared to the percentage of the whites treated unfairly